Welcome to Poets Speak. I'm Chard deNiord, the Poet Laureate of Vermont, and this week I'm very happy to welcome Gary Margolis to the studio. Gary's the author of 4 books of poetry: Raking the Winter Leaves, New and Selected Poems; Fire in the Orchard, which was published in 2002 and was nominated for the Pulitzer Prize for poetry. Falling Awake, which was published in 1986 by the University of Georgia Press. The Day We Still Stand Here was published in 1983 by the University of Georgia Press. Gary is also the author of Runner Without a Number, which was published in 2015, I believe. He's a Robert Frost Fellow at the Bread Loaf Writers Conference and a recipient of a Vermont Council of the Arts Award. He's published his poems in several magazines, several literary journals, including Poetry, The American Scholar, Poetry Northwest, and many others. Gary's a licensed psychologist, a former executive director of counseling and former associate professor of English at the Middlebury College in Vermont here. He lives now in Cornwall, Vermont, where he's a volunteer firefighter. Gary, it's a great pleasure to welcome you to Poets Speak. I wonder if we could start by just hearing a poem of yours, a poem of your choice that you would like to read.
Be happy to, Chard, and thanks for this invitation. And to have a beautiful summer ride from Cornwall down to Brattleboro. This poem is called The Hand of Peace. In the 50s, on the first early morning talk show hosted by Dave Garroway, who has since died by his own hand, the Kellogg Company sponsored a contest for cats and dogs their owners claimed could talk. A panel of judges, speech therapists, and lexicographers listened to the howls and whines, the growling barks and meows, and judged which sounds were closest to human speech. Each pet spent a minute making the most of his voice, and his master was paid increasing amounts for any noise that turned into a syllable and then a word. A boxer from Indianapolis, loyal to her time, sang the name Eisenhower so well the general himself invited her to the White House, and later took the dog on his campaign. Across the country, pet owners were mouthing 2- and 3-syllable words in front of their pets, except the parakeet and the mynah bird, disqualified because of their skill to mimic real talk. A Vermonter thought of bringing in a Canada goose that kept flying over her in the 1950s, who flew in a flock that looked more like a tuning fork than a V. Each time he honked, he barked the words, "Look, look." Even if she could have caught him, it's unclear how he would have done sitting on the spot under those hot studio lights. Dave Garroway sat there for 20 years and signed off each show with his hand held up, Indian style, which today, flying over, the geese still look for as a sign of peace.
Thank you. Wonderful poem. What inspired that?
That's a good question, Chard. To try to remember kind of what inspired the poem. I think it's probably a combination of things. As you noted, in my working life, I've been a psychologist, and so the relationship between poetry and counseling work and the people and situations that cross that path. In all of its richness, I think has that combination in that poem, meaning the memory of Dave Garroway specifically, and the sadness of how he ended his life, But then simultaneous to that, also the memory of this wonderfully playful television show that did invite people to bring in pets who could mimic, if not speak, some human words, or close to it. So the poem kind of playfully intersects those, but also has its seriousness around Dave Garroway's life, and also how both animals and ourselves are trying to find the words and the language and to make our own sounds too.
Right, our own music.
Yeah, our own music.
Yeah.
And like a number of contemporary poems too, how poems kind of weave political, or at least the gesture toward the political. So in this poem, it's playfully toward President Eisenhower.
Yeah.
And the imagination.
Yeah.
That he would bring this particular pet on his campaign trail.
Right. You consistently bring ordinary life into your poems, ordinary daily experience, and I notice that you have an amazing discipline in your writing. You sometimes post a poem a day on Facebook. I've noticed. Could you talk a little bit about your writing process and how that works exactly? It's as if you're panning for gold every day, poetry gold, and finding enough of it to keep going.
Almost 9 years ago now, I completed my long work at Middlebury College in counseling, and I didn't think of it as a retirement. I thought of it as completing my service, but also having been a high school and college athlete, the practice of going to practice and being with the activity, and being with, in this case, poetry, being with the material. Yeah. That as I was making that transition into retirement, after a morning walk, a daily morning walk of about an hour, I would go into my study, and something that had not been pre-planned, some line, some image, some imagination around a particular speaker would inevitably, and has inevitably, emerged. And then I would say to myself, start writing from that phrase, not knowing where it was going, hopefully, but attending to what was happening as the poem was emerging. Meaning it, as you said before, the music, image, metaphor, narrative, pieces of phrases. And so that practice then more recently, meaning the last few years, intersected with Facebook. And as I've been writing these poems, with really very little expectation about their continuity. Yeah. Meaning, how long would I keep doing this? Yeah. What really has inspired them in some ways is I'm getting to the end of a first draft with them. The idea that somebody that I might know, or be a near stranger, or someone far away, might actually be receiving the poem, hearing it. Yeah. It has really what's been carrying the energy of the practice.
So it's opened up a whole new vista for you in many ways, as far as audience. I noticed there's a fascinating quality of anonymity in a lot of your work. You as the kind of selfless observer. I mean, the title of your book, your most recent book, even Runner Without a Number, which is actually about the Boston Marathon, right. Has really created a wonderful conceit in your speaker throughout a lot of your poems, and it must come from having done therapy or been a therapist for many years as well. Just listening, and then how to convert that listening into poetry and those stories that you hear or heard every day as a therapist. Which have a kind of specificity to them, but not necessarily a poetry.
Right.
Moving from those stories to poetry, trying to make that leap with as little irritable reaching as possible.
Yeah. Thanks for your observation with that, which is, as a therapist, a counselor, and hours of being in the with and in the presence, of the other person, and listening very specifically to, to their struggles, their struggles and their stories, and the way they are telling their own story.
Yeah.
The rhythm of those stories.
Right.
And with the language that they're choosing. But it's been a lifetime of listening.
Yeah.
And responding.
The right time.
Yeah. Some people tease me that I went to graduate school in order to be able to nod my head at the right time. But that listening has been finding its voice in these poems, where I'm thinking about not only who or what will receive them, but the context of time. Time beyond us.
Do you have a poem that addresses that? I mean, the other. I mean, Blake has this wonderful quote. William Blake. There's the most sublime act that one can commit or enact is to set another before him. And which is what therapy, in a way, is all about. Listening, the act of listening, which can become a kind of sacred exercise. But I wondered if you had a poem. I love your poem about Galway Canal, where you're setting him before you. I mean, you're in the audience there with a lot of other people during an official event, but you are viewing him as this important other who's being recognized at the State House. I think it's near the end of the book here. It's on, let's see.
Yeah, I have it.
You got it? Okay.
I have it. So like many of us, I mean, I was fortunate to cross paths with Galway in a number of circumstances.
We should just say who Galway was for maybe those who don't know. He was the Poet Laureate of Vermont after Robert Frost, 25 years or so after Robert Frost. The state legislature decided that there should be another Poet Laureate besides Robert Frost, and they appointed Galway in 1989. And of course, he was just a gigantic figure in the poetry world in this country and internationally, won the Pulitzer Prize and the National Book Award and so forth and so on, and decided to live up in Sheffield, Vermont after teaching, well, actually beginning in the early 60s, but he commuted back and forth between NYU and where he taught and Sheffield and made his home there.
Yes. And as we know, thank goodness while he was alive, he was honored at the State House. Right. By a wonderful set of poets and readers and family members. Yes. At that reading. So this was a way both to commemorate that, and at the same time to go beyond that particular moment too. And it's called For Galway Canal at the State House. Under Washington, his portrait, in this chamber, the well of the house, we've come to honor one of our own. Word neighbor, poem maker, champion of using is 3 times rightly, consecutively in a verses line. Here, where our state's once governor welcomes us, asks what our state would be if we well-sitting poets were voted in to cast our votes. We're sitting at their desks with the aye and nay switch at hand, listening to his words read back to him by our poetry's representatives. His writing, singing airs, who, as Frost said, say his poems into the listening air. Our poet sitting among us, holding his hand to his ear, speaker-like. Although you can be sure he can read their lips for a scent of bare love moaning from a bedroom, a field's lipstick of blueberries, as well as for the pause between words, where he lives too in our fortunate Vermont. We can fill a well with the songs of Galway Cannell, whom we can't do without, who's not here to sit for his portrait, who still speaks inside and out, who rises to our long-standing applause.
Very nice. Galway died in 2015, I think. Just listening to you read made me think about poetry as a kind of therapy, and the therapy for the nation, for individuals, not in any clinical sense, but you must have thought about that idea a lot. Poetry is a kind of corrective, as a necessary witness to corruption, to tyranny, to demagoguery. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Well, for any of us, and I'm even thinking of this right now, Chard, as we were walking up the stairs in this this large and town-filled building, and you said this is the old high school in Brattleboro.
Right.
I'm thinking about how, for any of us, as we start being in school, and we're handed that first piece of blank paper, a pen and a pencil, and said, and either prompted to write something, or someone says to us, "What have you been feeling today? What have you been thinking about? What's happened? What's been meaningful to you today?" Even, as a 7th grader, as a 12th grader, and beyond. The ultimate act of being able to go inside of yourself and then start to make words and story and connection with it. So the metaphor making in poetry. What is the relationship, surprisingly, sometimes between this and this? But the freedom really to write and speak one's heart and mind initially, and that freedom, I think, is below and beyond democracy.
Yeah, there's a famous quote by the Polish poet who became an American, won the Nobel Prize, says, well, Miłosz, who said, what is poetry that can't save a nation or a people? And then he answers that it's compliance with official lies. That's a pretty bold claim for poetry. And
with that, the poet Carolyn Forche has recently been writing about that and posting different things in relation to, I'm not going to say this administration, but let's say any administration's relationship to art and culture as a canary in the mine. To what extent do people in power, in administrative power, and with that, to what extent, what is their relationship with art in the broadest sense, and with poetry? And to what extent not only are they familiar with it, but inviting of it as a way of saying, yes, we have a relationship with the present and the past of art. And in fact, it's one of the bedrocks of culture. And so to what extent do we see that being enacted and demonstrated state to state, within the nation and across nations too. It's sometimes also instructive to ask students, has there been poetry in your house? Has there been poetry in your family or family history?
Yeah.
And surprisingly, to see what all ages remember about that or not.
Yeah. We live in a culture where not too many people read poetry or hear it. I mean, poets might think that there are a number of, or that there's a large number of folks listening and reading the poetry because they travel in certain circles. But actually only about 5 or 6%,
Right.
according to the latest NEA statistics, read poetry or literary fiction. So there's this kind of disconnect in this country, isn't there, between all of the books that are being published, poetry books and workshops and MFA programs, and the people who are actually reading poetry or taking it in as important language that could change their lives. And I was wondering, as a therapist, you step outside of poetry when you're doing that. If you met people or who are reading poetry or who are open to reading poetry as a way of doing just what you just said, as far as speaking or finding a language for their emotions, their thoughts, their ideas, their whatever might be bothering them.
There have been times in counseling sessions, where I get astounded by how people are expressing, their pain, their confusion, their curiosity, and we might stop and say, that sounds like a poem to me, and that gathers a certain kind of attention. One, it's an affirmation.
Yeah.
And it's also kind of a recognition between two people. I'm talking about really sitting in a room with a client or a patient, and hearing how they're choosing or unconsciously the language is just coming out to try to not only communicate to the counselor, but also to themselves.
That's the most overhearing themselves.
Overhearing themselves.
Yeah.
And finding, let's even bring in another genre of language, finding the soul inside of themselves. Finding the part that both has words and not, but it's known to us as individuals.
Yeah.
Finding the soul.
You've got a wonderful poem called "Reading into Things in Our Workshop," which is at the end of this same book, Running Without a Number, where you sort of address a lot of those same, you're not in a therapy session, but you're in a workshop here where some of the same sort of psychological dynamics go on. And I just think it might be interesting for our audience to hear that poem. It's on page 105.
Yep. So it's called Reading into Things in Our Workshop. And sometimes people will say, "Well, Gary, this has to be you who's speaking here." And the speaker as writer, the speaker as persona, kind of telling the event of a situation. And the answer for me when someone says that, it's always yes and no. That I may be writing about something that actually happened, but actually happened also means inside my imagination or anyone's imagination too.
Right.
So although this poem uses names, first names, the listener will have to decide to what extent that is a particular person. Reading into Things in Our Workshop. Linda says maybe her friend Maureen meant us to take her word this way, and not how Oscar heard it, reading the poem to himself after his boyfriend called out of the blue, saying he wasn't sure if he could stay in the relationship, wasn't sure what anything meant anymore. Seals wondering if the use of bitch has something to do with her. What she said last week when it was her turn to speak without thinking, too much first, when she was just saying what she felt, what came to her, before Maureen gave her a look, and comments seemed to fly around the room, turning trash talk into art. A form, no kidding, Arthur thought came into being in this workshop when it was his turn to read what he brought. Art passed out a blank sheet so everyone could say what a heart says, which is a bitch to get right this afternoon when Richard, Oscar's lover, we learned a few classes ago, walks into the room holding his revision like a broken arrow, saying he was sorry for being later than he thought. He was sitting in his car in the parking lot, trying to find words that hurt less, that could be taken back.
It's a great kind of window there into just the dynamics of a workshop,
Yeah.
but also the subtlety and power of nuances in language.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
The
and how they work in the most intimate kind of settings.
Yeah, like what we were saying before, when you're kind of developing, writing that first draft, but simultaneously you're aware of what is emerging, both in terms of content, the story, and then particular words that more organically want to kind of come back or repeat themselves or come into another syntactical, form of itself. So those are things I'm not kind of hopefully overthinking about. Just,
right.
But that you have that kind of multiple awareness, which is the same of what happens in therapy.
Yeah, that's right. That interface between those two settings.
Yeah, kind of a felt observation.
Yeah, absolutely. There was a fellow here a couple of weeks ago named Tom Regal who talked about felt reasoning, felt
That's a good
thinking, combining the two,
Yeah.
Mind and the heart. Well, this is a good sort of place to transition to talk about your work with shamans as well. If you'd like to do that, in 1993, I believe it was that you went to Ecuador and wrote. Let me see if I can get a better view of this book for folks. This book here called Seeing the Songs, which is a wonderful account of your experience there with one or more than one, several shamans who act as sort of often go-betweens between the other world, the spirit world, and the real world, which is actually what happens often in poetry as well. But so as a therapist and as an observer of shamans in Ecuador, I wonder if you could talk a little bit about those two worlds and the language that you've observed as both kind of runic language as well as accessible language that defines the poetry of the two.
Well, as you say, in the early 90s, I received a phone call from somebody I hadn't heard from in 25 years, who said, "I'm coming through Middlebury. Would you like to have lunch on the Otter Creek? I think we have interests in common." And he came and he told me a long story about his work, his regrets, his trying to transform his own life, given what he had done earlier in his life, that he was carrying as regret, if not shame. But that led to a conversation of whether or not I would be interested with another small group of writers and physicians to go to Ecuador, where he had been in the Peace Corps, and where he still had connection with indigenous people. So, you know, having lunch, sitting on the Otter Creek is easy to say, oh yeah, that sounds great. Well, in fact, it happened, and he put it together, where we made this trip to the high Andes and into the Oriente in the disputed territory with Peru, and through this compadre of his, we had experiences with indigenous healers, curanderos y curanderas, shamans. And all I can say about that, as you can imagine, that you had to be there. You had to be there to believe what you were experiencing and seeing. Simultaneous to the singing and the chanting of native language.
What kind of actual healings did you witness?
So one particular one that I write about in this accounting and recounting of this trip was there was a woman in a village, and the village actually is called Mietzal. And in that village, two shamans had been called as a woman from that village had been going through a serious depression, had been depressed for months because her husband had run away to another shaman, his wife. Not an uncommon world story. But she'd been seriously depressed.
So not actually that uncommon or different from things you would have seen in Middlebury.
And their form of healing with her was to sing to her for 8 hours. So if you can imagine, you know, being in a native house, and these two men in trance came to sing to her. She was lying in front of them, and me and my group were on the edges of this lodge, and they sang to her for 8 hours, and that in itself becomes entrancing, and what the book accounts is I was in my sleeping bag, and listening both in and out to this healing, and of course within the culture.
Must have seemed like a dream to you.
Yeah, it became a dream and a vision.
Yeah.
And what I mean specifically was that after about 6 hours of this, I looked up and the image of a jaguar was floating above me, out here.
A little scary.
I thought, fasten your seatbelt. You're in a very evocative environment. Try not to freak out. You're in a powerful other environment. I just took some deep breaths, and after 2 or 3 minutes, that image went away.
You thought it was real?
I thought the image was real. And there were howlings in the jungle. And when I came back from this trip and started to read more in depth, literally about the Shuar Indians who we were with, I came to learn that their power animal is
the jaguar.
Is the jaguar, which I did not know.
Yeah.
I did not know before that.
It's fascinating.
But let's use that as a metaphor for our conversation, too, which is what happens when you're writing a poem, and you think you're in a certain kind of known or comfort area in that, and then something starts to gnaw at the doorstep. Meaning, something that seems uncomfortable, that maybe the poem was aware of but has been avoiding, or the writer's been avoiding.
Yeah.
And then you come to this place about, am I going to include this? Is the poem going to say this? Or is it going to gesture toward it? Is it going to find a way to coincide with the thing that has been very troubling? And so, even as an example of that from reading the Dave Garroway poem.
Yeah.
I could have chosen not to say how Dave Garroway died, not to use the word suicide in that poem.
Right.
But I thought that would have been, in a sense, not only not factually true, but it would have made the poem too humorous or sweet without its simultaneous reality.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Well, shifting to another reality that you experience often, you work in a maximum security prison, reading poetry to prisoners, and also I think conducting workshops there as well.
Yeah. So this was something that I have as a volunteer,
right.
not a paid employee, but as a volunteer over the past 2 falls that I've had the opportunity to do, to facilitate a poetry program in a correctional facility, a maximum security correctional facility.
Right.
So what has come from that is the engagement of that experience, or at least what I experienced, going into that incarcerated place, and then trying to find some words for my experience of that. So this book that actually is coming out in a few months is called Time Inside.
Good title.
And it's their time, it's my time, it's the outer time, it's inside time.
Yeah.
And I'd be happy to read.
You want to read a poem?
I'd be happy to read the kind of preface poem.
Oh yeah. Whatever you feel it would be, give us a clear idea of the experience there.
And the experience of being in the poem making there. So you'll see that seasonally, this poem takes place in winter, and the poem is called "I Made a Tree Inside My Cell," and like a number of contemporary poems, the title becomes the first line of the poem too. I made a tree inside my cell and hung some paper bells I cut from memory. The angel I had to believe was inside me. Even with men raving on my block, using a kind of gangster reindeer talk, I gave myself everything I could receive, nothing that could pass through a metal memory. Randomly, I guessed today would be my day to be stripped searched, to have my cell tree tossed, so the bells could think they were ringing for me and the angel on my block. Dressed in snowing everyday green, I made a manger in my cell, my paper room, and lit a match to bring the wise men in, to celebrate my loneliness, to see a ribbon's fuming smoke.
Fascinating.
You could hear the in a sense, the style of that poem compared to the other poems I read.
Yeah, it's a little more formal. It's a little more.
A little bit more formal in its in its music.
Yes.
And pacing.
Yeah, right. What do you think you capture in the poem here in the poetry that wouldn't come through in prose or a description of the experience, a prosaic description, a kind of diary entry?
Right. The imagining of inmates in their cells during holidays or a holiday like Christmas. So the coinciding of imagining that, and then also trying to bring some of those common images to that. So I made a manger in my cell, with hopefully, kind of the echoes that surround that.
Yeah.
And the idea of setting a fire in that cell. So in this book, there are other poems that are much more kind of concrete and less metaphoric. But here I wanted to introduce that by some things that are specific to that moment. Christmas in a prison.
Right.
But also letting the poetry, or elements of poetry, be the way to speak about it.
So the kind of inherent pathos in this scene. Now, these are folks who aren't going to get out, most of them.
Correct.
Right?
Correct.
They're lifers. And so this idea of making a manger in their cell, along with a lot of the other imagery in the poem, is just as sort of especially poignant with regard to their future, their life there, vis-a-vis your life as a poet coming in and talking to them from the outside.
That's important what you just said about coming in from the outside, coming in from my time, my free experience of time.
Your privilege.
My privileged time. To theirs, and so in this section of poems, my commitment was not to try to represent their experience, not to write about anything that I observed, say, on a given day there. But it was more about I wanted to and needed to write about my transition into that space.
With objectivity rather than interpretation.
Not interpreting, not speaking for them.
That's right.
Not interpreting their experience, and not even quoting their experience. So I had all that.
But
that's not what. That to me that would have felt. Wrong.
Presumptuous.
Exactly.
Yeah, so the power of the poetry is creating a kind of, as Philip Larkin, the poet, once said, a unique distance from isolation. That just, and which is a gift to the reader, for them to cross over into that scene with as much clarity and objectivity as possible.
And with their related experience, trying to relate to the speaker in these poems.
Exactly. Wow, powerful. I wish you luck with this.
Hey, thank you.
That's great. I didn't even know this was coming out. Well, unfortunately, our time has come to an end here. It's gone by very quickly, and I'm so happy you could make it down here today and talk. And we could talk for a lot longer, but I
My pleasure,
hope
Chard.
The audience has gotten a good idea of your work and your life.
Thank you for doing this, and as we were saying before, ensuring that art and poetry is present.
Yeah, in Vermont, where there's such a rich legacy, and where there continues to be a rich legacy. So, and you're part of it. So, thanks, Gary.
Hey, thank you.